COVID was a very good example. Governments wanted to say to people, we're just doing what the science tells us to do. The science didn't tell us what to do. It helped us understand the problem we were facing, but it didn't tell us how to make trade-offs between lockdowns versus preventing the spread of the virus. The most difficult answer to give to a question for anyone in the public eye is, I don't know. But it's very important that people do give that answer on occasions. You could list 8 or 9 areas of policy that call out for radical change, whether it's in our health provision, social care, design of the tax system, provision of enough resources for defence, infrastructure, preventing spillage of sewage into our seas and rivers. You could go on and on. Many of these things are not working properly, and they won't be improved just by speeches or by marginal changes. It will require a whole series of quite radical reforms. We've not taken seriously the education and training that young people deserve to have. Far too many have been sent to universities to study courses which they might be fun for 3 years, but it's a kind of 3-year holiday. And the jobs aren't there afterwards because over 50% of the cohort go to university and there aren't jobs for the skills which they acquired at university.
Baron King of Lothbury is Emeritus Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. He served as Governor of the Bank of England and Chairman of its Monetary Policy Committee from 2003 to 2013. Lord King was knighted in 2011, made a Life Peer in 2013, and appointed a Knight of the Garter in 2014. His most recent books include The End of Alchemy and a further book he's co-authored, and that is Radical Uncertainty, Decision-Making for an Unknown Future. We're talking in London, and can I say, Lord King, that I'm deeply appreciative of your time.
It's a pleasure to be with you, John.
Thank you. And can we begin by saying I'm quite passionate about good economics because to me, despite perhaps the fact that it induces a yawn in a lot of people, it's about better outcomes for people. It's about opportunity, prosperity, security, but it's known as the dismal science. Why?
Well, the phrase the dismal science came from Thomas Carlyle in the 19th century, at a time when economists were saying the problem with our economy is that even if we get output to grow faster, population will then increase even faster, and so we can never be any better off. That's why it was dismal. Now, I think since then, economics has changed. It's not dismal. It's about how we can boost productivity growth. And in that sense, there is some good news behind the thinking of economists.
So you've lamented the impact of university economics, in inverted commas, on the global economy via its influence on institutions such as central banks. You, of course, as a former central banker of great note. What is this, for want of a better term, economic groupthink?
So I think the problem has arisen really in the last 2 or 3 decades as economics has become more and more specialized. In that sense, it's the maturing of a discipline. But it's rather withdrawn from the world. I mean, you're right in saying that economics is not like pure mathematics or the study of something for the sake of it. Economics really is about finding ways to help people make better decisions, whether in their own lives or businesses or government. And it has that practical bent. But an awful lot of economics has tended to withdraw and become a rather self-referential framework, an academic discipline in which people really only care about what other people in the same group think. And I think that has made it less relevant to the way in which we need to confront the practical problems we face. I don't think it's because economics is too mathematical at all. I don't think that's the issue. The issue really is that the world is so complex that the study of academic economics can be incredibly valuable, to generate insights into how the world works. But what it cannot do is to be a literal description of how the world works. And I think too many people have used their models to make predictions about the world, which are not borne out. And they're not borne out because the world is too complex. It doesn't undermine the value of the models if they are used in the right way to get ideas and insights into the world, but not as a sort of literal description of what governments should do or what businesses should do.
There's a lot of controversy about modelling and how useful it is for public policy, including economic modelling. Can you elaborate a little on seeming over-reliance on modelling to make decisions that aren't necessarily practical?
So I think the fundamental issue is the following, that economics has adopted the idea that all of us, as individuals, families, governments, businesses, are trying to optimize something. We're trying to maximize profits or social welfare. We're all trying to optimize. And we can write down a mathematical description of the constraints we all face, and then we maximize something. And the difficulty with this can generate some useful insights into how the world works. But in practice, the world is so complex that it's impossible to optimize anything. If you go to a business, you'll know, you don't sit around saying, well, what do we do to maximize profits? Because we just simply don't know enough about it. We can try to make better decisions. We can try to improve the profits of the business. We can try to make the welfare of the country better off. But to assume that we know enough about it to optimize is a delusion, and a very important delusion. So that we saw a good example, I think, during COVID, when not just economists, but epidemiologists thought they understood enough to make precise quantitative forecasts of either how many people would die or what would happen to GDP. And they were wrong. Not because they were stupid. They weren't stupid, but they didn't know enough about the world. We didn't know enough about the virus to make that kind of forecast. And so it's what's missing, I think, is a willingness to accept that we have limited knowledge. Hayek talked a lot about this in his Nobel Prize winning lecture and in his written work. And it's absolutely fundamental to accept that there are severe limits on our knowledge, which we need to take into account when we make decisions. We can read articles and books that may help us think more clearly about the problem that we face. But most of the problems that we face, which require decisions, are unique problems that haven't arisen before, and we have to think our way through it. And thinking our way through it is much more complicated than simply saying, oh gosh, let's maximize something, optimize something. And I think that's where economics has fallen down.
Is there a parallel in an age, it seems to me, where, as you said, the world's become such a complex place that very often politicians will resort to experts with their models because it all looks too complex? And perhaps that could be applied to COVID and even, dare I say it, to climate change policy, because it's so complicated, it's beyond our political leaders often. I hate to say that. So they almost outsource it. And I suspect that breeds cynicism in the electorate. It's part and parcel of the breakdown of trust that we're seeing and disengagement in Western democracies.
I think that is absolutely right. COVID was a very good example. Governments wanted to say to people, we're just doing what the science tells us to do. The science didn't tell us what to do. It helped us understand the problem we were facing, but it didn't tell us how to make trade-offs between lockdowns versus preventing the spread of the virus, difficult judgments. And the whole point about science is that science is always about challenge. Science is about the fact that we don't understand everything, and it's exciting because we can push the frontiers back and hope to learn more in the future. But there is no such thing as settled science. And it's a mistake to pretend that. And you're absolutely right that one thing I think people are very good at doing is to see through bluff when they sense it. And, we saw this in Britain with the debate on Brexit. Both sides in that debate were wildly exaggerating what they thought they knew about the consequences of a decision to leave the European Union. And people reacted by saying, they can't possibly know that. And that's what destroys and undermines trust. And I think, the government leading that campaign to stay in the EU lost it in large part because they made exaggerated claims which could not be backed up. They, instead of saying, we don't really know, but maybe this isn't the time to jump into the unknown, an argument that might have been more compelling to the electorate, they told everyone, you'll all be £4,300 worse off. And that they couldn't possibly have known that.
Yeah.
And people saw that. And so they lost trust in the individuals who were making these claims. And that affected the way they reacted. And I think it is true that, the most difficult answer to give to a question for anyone in the public eye is, I don't know. But it's very important that people do give that answer on occasions, because the questioners don't know the answer either. And the challenge, and this was very clear in COVID, was to navigate our way through a problem where we knew very little about the virus at the beginning. We didn't really know how well to treat it for those who were sick. We didn't quite know what the right measures to take were in the economy. And instead of the government saying, this is a difficult problem, a serious problem, this is what we know so far, there's an awful lot we don't know, this is what we've decided to do at this stage, but we will have to change this as we learn more as we go along. That was a sort of credible argument, but it wasn't made. It was all, no, this is obviously the right thing to do because that's what the science tells us to do. And that was false.
It is worrying. If I could come back to economics for a moment, again, I deplore the lack of capacity on the part of so many modern political leaders to explain some basic realities to people. Mm-hmm. And one of those is the explosion in debt everywhere.
Yes,
You're
exactly.
Seeing, if you don't mind me saying so, as an Australian looking at Britain's debt to GDP ratio, it's really quite concerning. It will really constrain future generations. In fact, it's probably arguably very unfair on future generations. But part of, we see all sorts of theories floating around, modern monetary theory being one of them. It seems to me to pretend that you can just produce money out of thin air. Does this come back to the question of economists not being in a position of sufficient authority anymore to say, you can't do those sorts of things? Does that allow for wild ideas to take over? They're conveniently comforting, but very unwise?
So I think the challenge facing any discipline, of which economics is one, is that if people say wild things, the temptation of sensible people is to say, that is completely wrong. This is the only correct answer. And again, they start to make claims which are too strong. The problem with modern monetary theory is that it's neither modern nor monetary nor a theory. And it simply says, if you print enough money, we can all be better off. But what we know is, and history tells us, there are so many examples in history. If you print enough money, you'll get inflation. This is not rocket science. It goes back to David Hume in the 18th century. And, these ideas are fundamental and fairly obvious points to make. Now, that doesn't tell you what happens if you print 5% more money. That's a more complicated question. But if you do enough of it, you'll get inflation. It cannot possibly be a method for boosting productivity growth. After all, central banks can print money at will, either through printing notes or simply by buying government bonds and adding to the bank accounts of people in the country. But that doesn't do anything to improve productivity or anything else. The consequences have to be thought through. And if you're in a deep depression, then it may make sense to print more money and stimulate spending and get back towards full employment. If you're in full employment, it doesn't make sense to print a lot more money. And that's why it was very odd that during COVID, central banks around the world decided to do a lot of so-called quantitative easing, printing money, in essence. There was no need for it. Governments had already taken very substantial steps to borrow money and give it to people to tide them over the consequences of COVID. I think that was probably a sensible thing to do in the short run. But the consequences of this were twofold. One, central banks should not have entered the scene and stayed out of the action and not printed all the extra money. And secondly, as you said, John, that if you increase government debt too much, this is going to be a burden on our children and grandchildren. And we're in a world now where, our grandchildren are already facing substantial amounts of interest servicing payments to finance the interest that's going to be due on government debt. And it's not just in Britain. It's true, even more true in the United States and around Europe.
Yes.
So I think that the problem of debt is enormous. And the right approach to it is to say, if you're facing a war or a pandemic, you may need to borrow more in the short run. But then you've got to be in a position once that's over to see the ratio of national debt to national income slowly falling back again, so that when the next war or pandemic comes, there is room to borrow to deal with that emergency. But that's not what's happening at present. It is continuing to expand, despite the fact that we're back at full employment.
Can I test an idea that seems to me to make sense? We saw the great financial crisis. We saw governments lend extraordinarily, take private sector companies onto their books, private sector debt onto their books. As it started to ease, it seemed to me that a great fissure was opening up in Western society where people would not accept the discipline to pay back the debt, live within their means, boost productivity, as you said. They wanted their cake and eat it too. And politicians backed by economists seem to lack the willpower to say, no, we've got to be more responsible. We need to patch up those balance sheets against the next crisis. So that's point one. Is that what happened? And because it's become exacerbated, I think, by COVID. Yeah. And I would argue poorly designed environmental policies going forward as well, adding to the burden.
Yeah.
So there's a double-barrel question in there. The second part of it is, inevitably, once you start to make money easily available, print money, you will get inflation. We didn't get it for a long time, but now we've got it in the worst possible places, in asset prices. Mm-hmm. So those who have money are wealthier than ever in Western societies. Those who don't find it harder than ever to get a start.
Well, certainly one of the problems of the last 15 years is that the measures that were put in place, and I was there, to cut interest rates and to engage in quantitative easing, were seen as short-term measures, only short-term measures, to prevent a repetition of another Great Depression, which we were facing at that point. And the idea was that we'd get interest rates back to more normal levels sooner rather than later. Now, that didn't happen. And I think there was a slow growth in the world economy meant that nobody was really willing to actually stop the injection of money into the economy. But keeping interest rates at that lower level has created enormous problems, both, I think, in terms of freezing the allocation of resources. We stopped seeing people move from companies that were performing poorly to better performing companies, which is an important ingredient of productivity growth in the economy as a whole. And we also, because we kept interest rates very low for a long while, saw asset prices rise and rise, which has created an inequality in the distribution of wealth between those who started with assets and the younger generation that didn't. And the most vivid example is in terms of house prices, where the average age that people become homeowners has risen very sharply. And the younger people find it, very difficult to raise money to buy a house. And I think that what we've seen in the last 20 years that's led to disillusion with economic performance is that most people, don't start life by saying, I want to be an economist. How do I think about it? They look at the community into which they're born. They look at their family circumstances, and they'd like to follow in the same footsteps. And we had a period for a very long time in which it was commonly accepted and achieved that the children would be better off than their parents. Yep. But if they lived in a community, the community was still there, the industries were still there, And what we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years is the destruction of that dream, so that you were born into a community with, very highly profitable businesses and firms and industries. Many of these have gone under with the wave of globalization leading to the contraction of manufacturing. We've seen that the dream of becoming a homeowner at the same age as your parents in a nice house, that has gone, as people can't afford, unless their parents will pay for it themselves. This exacerbates the inequality. And I think, the younger generation are quite rightly not enamored with the economy in which they've been born into and are growing up into. They don't seem to have the same opportunities that their parents had. And that is a complete reversal. My generation, I call the lucky generation, because we grew up in a world in which almost all of us were better off than our parents. And that was a norm, that people expected that, and we achieved it. Now that's gone into reverse, and that's going to be a big challenge politically to cope with that. And we're not helping matters by burdening our grandchildren with a very large amount of national debt, which they'll have to service.
Seems to me there's another aspect to this that's important. The disillusionment in general, other social factors common to much of the world, means that there will be less children to, if you like, share that debt. It makes the burden for those who are coming through even worse. Young people are delaying family formation because they can't get a home. They're worried about their economic future. Some are deciding, in surprising numbers are deciding, not to have children at all. And that makes the whole thing worse.
It makes it worse. It's not universal, because some parts of the world are still seeing population grow rapidly, but they're in the parts of the world where that may lead to enormous pressure to migrate away from their home country into places like Europe. And Europe is facing a potential explosion of migrants who want to come and live in Europe. They can look on their mobile phones at home in Africa and see the high standards of living in Europe, and they make something of it. And Europe doesn't have an answer to this. And the only long-run solution that's going to work, really, is to find ways in which we can hope to encourage African countries to grow faster themselves and create opportunities and greater prosperity at home, so people don't want to leave. But this immigration across the world has become a massive issue, and there's no simple answer to it. But one thing that has gone wrong is governments making promises but they can't deliver on, and that leads to disillusion. Our government in the UK clearly suffered a great deal from that. But I do think that there's a big challenge here for to think about the interaction between population growth and our future economy. Interestingly, countries like Japan and China are already facing this problem in a marked way. We are clearly facing in Europe challenges in providing social care for the elderly who can't easily look after themselves. But we're not very successful at taking resources away from, say, education, where there are fewer people going through school. We find that hard to deal with that, because we all want to provide more in terms of education. And the demand for public services is expanding rapidly at a time when we don't have tax systems that are well designed enough to generate revenue to finance that without imposing, such high marginal tax rates that it will lead to disincentives. So I think there are big economic challenges coming. And in a way, these things happen without people being aware of them, because they happen slowly over time. And, if you go back 100 years, the issue of finding enough tax revenue wasn't really a major challenge, because the state was so small relative to the economy as a whole. And now people expect so many services to be provided by the state. And I think that will have to be rethought. Whether it's health, education, many other dimensions of services in our economy, they will need to be provided through a mixture of private and public. But just to ask the state to provide it is not easily, it'll just a guarantee that a grudging amount of tax will be raised and that not enough money will be given to those services to enable them to perform what they should be doing. They'll always be short of money.
You will have done some very deep thinking, I would have thought, I'm sure, about some of the things that need to be addressed, that leaders, if they were honest in levelling with people, would be putting before them. I would have thought it would have begun with an explanation of how serious the times are. People are not fools.
Indeed.
They will find the courage if you level with them.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I think what I found so depressing in our recent general election campaign was that despite the fact that we had two leaders of the main parties who were people who were obviously intelligent, decent people of integrity, and had chosen to commit to a life of public service rather than make a lot of money in the private sector, despite that, we saw very little being honest with the electors about the challenges down the road. And I think that doesn't work because people know that there are problems and they want people to come up with solutions which may be difficult, may be unpleasant for many of us, but at least they're honest. And that's what we don't get. And you could list 8 or 9 areas of policy that call out for radical change, whether it's in our health provision, social care, design of the tax system, provision of enough resources for defence, infrastructure, preventing spillage of sewage into our seas and rivers. You could go on and on. Many of these things are not working properly, and they won't be improved just by speeches or by marginal changes. It will require a whole series of quite radical reforms. And this will impose costs on people. Everyone talks about the need for more investment, but unless you can, no one's come up with a simple answer of how you suddenly dramatically boost economic growth. But if you want more investment, you have to accept there'll be less consumption. And that both public and private consumption needs to fall in order to finance more investment. The United Kingdom has the lowest national saving rate of any country in the G20.
Even worse than ours.
Yeah, that should be a national disgrace. Hardly features in debate and discussion.
One of the elephants in the room, it seems to me, for all Western countries, is that no one levels about the unfunded liabilities over and above our current debt levels that are going to descend on our children's shoulders.
Yes, I think, to be fair, Britain is less of an issue there because we had a good pension system that's unwound significantly with the end of defined benefit pension schemes, and that will create in the future more unfunded liabilities. I think they're bigger in Europe, but you're right. I mean, these things are not presented in a form where people understand the burden and the cost of the promises that are being made. And obviously, it's easy for me to criticize because politicians are in a competition for votes and people don't like to be given bad news. But as you say, I think there's a limit to that because they don't like bad news for the sake of it, doom and gloom, but they do value honesty. And if there is a problem that they can see, then they actually want people who will say, look, there is clearly a problem. We can all see it. This is what we will have to do to rectify that situation. And it does mean, either paying more for it or higher taxes or cutting back somewhere else. People are quite capable of understanding that, and they will value the honesty involved. What they really become disillusioned with, and you can see all the opinion polls show that trust in politics has fallen to an all-time low, is the people saying things that they can self-evidently not deliver.
Yes.
And that's what we've got to get over. After all, if you were President Xi in Beijing and a group of students turned up and said, we'd like some more democracy, please, in China, and he would say, well, it's interesting you say that. Let's take the United States. This election matters in the United States. 30,000 people will decide that election in a very small number of counties in swing states. Is that the kind of democracy you want? Well, look at Britain. Here's a party that got fewer votes than last time, massively more seats. Is that the way you want your representation in China to work? Or in France, the Rassemblement National wins a lot of votes, and then the next week it's in a minority because people have ganged up to stop it from winning. They try to override the rules of what were assumed to be the election game. And democracy, I think, is facing serious challenges because a combination of game, the commitment to the democracy and the system we have is not as credible as it used to be, and it's not delivering. And I think that the Western democracies face a big challenge now in trying to counter the argument that actually having one strong party or strong person running the country is more effective. And if we're not delivering, then that will appeal to many people around the world. It is very striking that when the West try to create a global alliance to isolate Russia because of their invasion of Ukraine, an awful lot of countries in the world refuse to condemn Russia. That's a real warning sign. So economic delivery is crucial, but there are many other aspects of policy where being more honest with voters, even if it means saying, well, I can't give you everything you'd like to have. Actually, I think in the end, people respect that.
Shortly before he died, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs told me that he was tripping around Britain talking to young people. Mm-hmm. And he was interested in two things. Where in an age of secularism and identity politics did they draw their ideas about right, wrong and, morality from? And that was one area of it. But the other area was how they felt about their future. And he said that overwhelmingly young British people, in his experience, knew that things were not good and that they would not enjoy the security and the opportunity and the prosperity of their parents. Mm-hmm. The question that arises out of that, for me, is how do we encourage younger people to step up into positions of leadership when they're cynical, disengaged, and don't think, as you've just so elegantly and frighteningly, chillingly warned us, they have good reason not to believe in the West, for want of a better term. We need leadership, surely.
We do, but individual young people looking at the prospects are voting with their feet, and we are losing from Britain very talented young people. Our students are going to the United States. Our young doctors are going to Australia.
Yes, that's true.
Or New Zealand, or Canada, or even the United States. There's a sort of a lack of enthusiasm in the environments in which they work. So, I'll give you a small example. There are many arguments for and against Brexit on either side, but the way it's been handled has meant that we've got sort of the worst of it. So many young people doing research, wanting to become leaders in various scientific disciplines, find that their colleagues in Europe don't want to come here again. There isn't a great deal of money around. They can't easily go into Europe because of Brexit. So they just think, well, maybe I should emigrate, or maybe the ones who used to come to Britain won't come to Britain anymore. Now, there's no reason why the fact that we've left the EU should lead to that outcome. We've rejoined the Horizon scientific program. But it was, I think, sort of incompetence in the way in which the transition to a post-Brexit world operated that led to these outcomes. And competence is the minimum requirement of government if it's going to attract support. So I think there is a real issue here about offering young people hope for the future, because, we've not taken seriously the education and training that young people deserve to have. Far too many have been sent to universities to study courses which, they might be fun for 3 years, but it's a kind of 3-year holiday. And the jobs aren't there afterwards, because over 50% of the cohort go to university, and there aren't jobs for the skills which they acquired at university. And we ought to be open about that to people. I mean, there's no point encouraging students all to go to university and to borrow large amounts of money to finance their fees and living expenses when we're not going to be able to provide jobs for them to service that debt that they acquire. So student debt is a problem across much of the Western world. I belong to the lucky generation because I never had to borrow a single penny to finance my education, right the way through to graduate school. That's not true of young people in Britain today. It's not surprising that they feel they can't afford to buy a home. They've got a burden of repaying student debt. What are the great prospects? Why not look abroad and go somewhere else? And I think that's one of the big challenges for the UK. And we've got to find a way in which there are opportunities that make people excited. And once they are excited about the opportunities, then I think they will want to become leaders in their own community. But it's very hard to become a leader simply on the basis of a protest vote. That doesn't generate good leadership. It generates good protesters, but it doesn't generate good leaders who have positive ideas about what to do with our society.
You touched on defence a moment ago. If we could come to that, despite the rising international concern about these being unstable times, a former Prime Minister of ours in Australia referred to what he called the arc of autocracy, that several nations that don't seem to have cultures that don't have much in common except a loathing of the West and a belief that our system's breaking down. We don't believe in it ourselves anymore. Yet, admirably, the new government in Britain has says it wants to increase defence spending. It's fairly low at the moment, although it's better than a lot of Europe, sort of around 2%. They want to take it to 2.5%.
Yep.
I guess there's a couple of things I'd be interested in your views on. Should we be doing more on defence, firstly? How do we encourage people in an age when they want butter, not guns, to spend more money? And then you've talked about a phrase that really caught my attention, the economics of defence. I mean, I guess as a former government minister, I've always seen it as an outlay, a necessary outlay, but not one that of itself produces greater prosperity when you're looking for more prosperity.
So the defence industry can be subject to potential corruption, wasting money because of procurement processes and so on, but it can also be a source of tremendous innovation. The space program generated lots of ideas, but defence too comes up with new ideas for technology. I mean, drones, for example, are being used commercially as well as in defence. And I think, therefore, as a whole, there are potential spin-offs from defence. But obviously the big question about defence is that governments, over 40 years thought there was going to be a peace dividend and decided they would take that by cutting expenditure on defence and either cutting taxes or spending more on other government programmes. And what we've seen is that's ended up in a situation where we're not capable easily of defending ourselves. So there'll have to be more money spent. So it is quite striking that in our efforts to help Ukraine, we're struggling to come up with enough production of munitions, shells, ammunition of all kinds, even just to give them to fight with. It beggars belief as to what would have happened if we had also been attacked. So there's going to have to be a significant investment in the hardware component of defence spending in order just to get back to where we were before the Ukraine invasion started. And I think that it also requires a change of mentality. So the country that I know well, which is very different from the UK and many other Western countries, is Finland. They were invaded twice by Russia. And so what they've decided to do is to ensure that there is absolutely no incentive for Russia to invade them, because Russia would suffer enormous losses if they did. They still have military conscription. They have reservists. They have a very powerful network of ensuring that there is resilience in the country to any shocks that might occur. People accept that it's a civic duty to be available to serve in the army if called up, to be trained, to ensure that, accept the impact on taxes or consumption of the need to invest in facilities so that they have lots of facilities if they had to withstand either an air attack or indeed some barriers to goods getting into Finland. They have stores. They have got a program which makes them resilient to things that could go badly wrong. And in parts because their own history showed that things could go badly wrong. And I think that, in Britain, we've never quite been, after the Second World War, the fact that we won, even though economically it made us essentially bankrupt as a nation, we've never really taken seriously the need to put in place facilities and a defence system, which means that, if the worst were to happen again, we could easily cope with it. And we're now in a position where we clearly couldn't. And I think this is very unfortunate. The Americans now feel that we could be a useful marginal addition to what they would do. But the idea of being a genuine partner and having the technology to play a big role just isn't there. And I think that governments will have to face up now to the need to spend more on defence over a long period. This 2.5% of GDP cannot be something that's just there for 2 or 3 years. It's going to be there indefinitely.
Again, it comes back to persuading. It's leadership. We've got to persuade people that investment's necessary.
Yes.
I mean, the 1930s in Britain was the story of appeasement. Young people understandably just didn't want to confront, I suppose, the nightmare of the trenches again. Mm-hmm. You had the so-called Oxford Pledge in 1933, right. Young people saying that under no circumstances would they fight and die for king and country. And yet a few short years later, it is an extraordinary story of how Britain actually had the might and the willpower, or put it the other way around, the willpower and the might, to rebuild quickly. I understand in 1938, little factoid from history, Britain only had around 100 fighting planes. The Germans had about 4,000. By 1939, perhaps there was something to be said for Chamberlain buying some time after all.
Yes.
They'd got to 660.
Yes.
And that was enough.
Yes.
And despite the Oxford Pledge, there were young men and women fighting for their country. We need a lot more leadership if we're going to incite that sort of commitment again, I would have thought.
No, I think that's right.
And that goes to whether we'd spend the money in the first place to get that hardware.
Yeah. And the expenditure that will be necessary means that it won't be available for personal consumption.
Yes.
And that's something which, politicians are reluctant to tell people because people won't like it. But I think we underestimate, particularly amongst younger people, their willingness to do something for a worthy cause. In fact, you could often say that one of the problems we face is that young people are searching for a cause, and they will find it often in causes that are not terribly attractive in many ways, but they will just jump on the bandwagon of that cause. But if we, offer them the chance to rebuild our national defence, our health service, social care, that's the kind of cause to which I think many young people would want to commit themselves, and then the leadership will follow from it.
And part of what you're saying is that done properly, the economics of defence mean that there will be benefits as well for, if you like, the consumption of butter.
Yes.
It'll produce technology, it'll advance.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Since the Enlightenment, there has been this view that you can rationally and even scientifically explain human behaviour. But I think you argue in the book you co-authored with John Kay, Radical Uncertainty, that that's not so, that there's much that's unpredictable. We ought not to try and pretend that we can predict everything.
Yes.
That a certain amount of uncertainty can be used as, it can be a great blessing. It'll provide opportunities you'd perhaps not foreseen.
Yes, absolutely.
My takeout from what I read of the book was almost the old adage, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. I don't know whether that's fair.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good way of putting it. And I think that the essence of what we were writing about in that book is that, practical problems that we all face, whether in our personal lives or for government decisions, are usually very complicated, unprecedented. You can't sort of look back and say, oh yes, I had exactly the same problem 3 weeks ago, and this is clearly the right answer. And that it's very important to understand that rational behavior is not the same as what economists call optimizing behavior. Rational behavior is about saying, what things could go badly wrong and what can I do to mitigate that occurring? Understanding the essence of the problem and not pretending that I can make precise predictions about the future. And that's what good decision making is all about. It's not pretending that we know enough to come out with a simple mathematical solution. Pop the problem into a spreadsheet or a computer and out drops the answer. Very few important decisions are like that. And if people therefore don't optimize, it's not because they are irrational, which is what economists tend to assume. It's because they're highly rational and realize that they don't know enough to pretend that they can optimize. They have to find a solution that's good enough. And good enough means avoiding the worst, but trying to make things better. Don't let, the best be the enemy of the good. And that's what good decision making is about. It's not that you then, even with the benefit of hindsight, can look back and say, I made 37 perfect decisions and 3 wrong ones. It's that I don't know whether I made the right decision or not, because I have no idea, what would have happened otherwise. But I did my best. And I, took advice from the right people, thought about the problem. You can set up structures for decision making that make it more likely that you'll make good decisions than bad ones. A very good example is what President Kennedy did when confronted with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is that privately in the White House, he had, 2 teams coming up with 2 different answers and then critiquing each other to try and make sure that all the things that could have happened were teased out somehow before they had to make a decision. He didn't rely just on the people's initial reactions from official positions. The military were very keen to attack Cuba. Once the whole thing was started to be discussed at greater length, it became clear the costs that were involved in all that. That might well turn out very badly. And the need to have hotlines with Russia, which is what emerged from that crisis and we put in place. So, life is complicated. And if you understand that, then there's no point pretending that decisions can just be described in terms of a simple optimizing model where computers will solve it for you. Judgment is absolutely paramount. And having the right people in the right positions who are going to make those judgments is clearly critical.
Very difficult for central bankers at the moment. They're charged with responsibility to keep inflation within a narrow band, but at the moment everybody's complaining about the cost of living, understandably, in Western countries. Politicians are undermining, I think, the respect of central bankers by criticising them. We're seeing a bit of that in our country. And you've got to take into account more than just inflation. You can see the independence being eroded away. Tough time for central bankers to, if I hear you correctly, to carefully evaluate but not pretend that there are scientific formulas. They have to make judgments.
Yes, absolutely. And I think they made one very bad judgment in COVID, which was to print a lot of money in order to try and hold things together. But actually, the problem with the pandemic was that we were shutting down the supply side of the economy in order to prevent the virus from spreading. And if you reduce the supply in the economy, the last thing you want to do is suddenly to boost demand by printing money. So I think the inflation that we saw was partly the result of, supply shortages from the pandemic, but partly the result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact on energy prices. But it also was in part the product of an unnecessary expansion of money in the economy when it wasn't needed. Now, it has come back. It's come back because interest rates rose from 0 to 5%, basically, around the world. So that was a very big change in monetary policy that was needed, whereas there were plenty of people who said, oh, this inflation is just transitory. You don't need to change interest rates at all. They would have kept rates close to zero. Good job central banks didn't follow that advice. They did raise interest rates, and I think they are back on track. I think but because of the failure to keep inflation close to the target and to have a compelling narrative as to what they were doing, then they're now open to criticism and people will step in to do it. I don't think that will necessarily persist, but I think one thing that is dangerous and will undermine the effectiveness of central banks is if they're always being asked to do things over which they have little control. So the classic example is some central banks have got very enthusiastic about trying to combat climate change. This is not the role of a central bank. Nobody ever created a central bank in order to prevent climate change. Government policies are important for that, and government departments have to deal with it. Central bank's job is a limited one. It's to ensure stability in the economy, of our price level, and our financial system. End of story. And that's a big enough task for anyone. And it's silly to ask central banks to do a whole lot more.
This comes to modelling again, if I may say so. So if we go back to COVID, you actually said something that really struck me, that the epidemiological models that we use to make predictions about the spread of COVID-19 and the number of deaths turned out to be just as bad as most economic forecasts.
Yes, absolutely.
And you went on to basically say that the modellers under pressure made up the numbers and that politicians relied on modellers with a known track record of spectacularly wrong epidemiological predictions, such as in the spread of mad cow disease. I remember that over here. I'm a beef producer and I was the Australian Minister for Agriculture at the time, and I remember the wild and woolly stuff's going on. But this raises again this whole issue. You talk about the central bank now having to take climate policy or change into consideration. Well, the problem is people are missing the reality here that if the modelling wasn't reliable in the short term over COVID, the ICPP, for example, International Panel for Climate Change, all of its predictions on the likely impact of climate change are low confidence. How can you possibly have central agency expected to devise policies when the modelling can't be relied upon? And what does that mean? You've made the obvious point. It's up to governments to mount the case.
Yeah, so I'd make 2 points on all this, one on each side in a way. The fact that we can't predict accurately what will happen is not an argument against taking policies to limit climate change. Because if the worst...
if I may say so, that's a really important point, and I don't want to be heard by our listeners to deny the need to take these things seriously. It's who takes them seriously and who's accountable to the people.
Yes, and the essence of that is to say, don't get bogged down by precise numbers here. Think about what measures we could take sensibly to limit the risks, but also to mitigate the damage from climate change. Some climate change may just now be inevitable. What can we do to offset the likely damage from that? People built dikes in the Netherlands centuries ago. There are things we can do over and above measures purely just to limit the extent of climate change. The second comment, though, is that we're not doing it very sensibly. So, if you were to take the issue really seriously, you would say there is a handful of countries that really matters here. And somehow we've got to do what we can to help them come to an agreement, to lay aside all their other differences and work together to prevent emissions that may accelerate climate change. But in the United Kingdom, legal obligation now to meet net zero as a country.
And Australia.
Yeah. And it will have no impact on global climate change, really, other than that's the moral one of setting an example. But the point I want to make is, if you've got a net zero commitment for a country, it does not follow from that every business and every organization individually has to get to net zero. In fact, that's the least efficient way of doing it. Some activities, some businesses, some organizations should end up being net positive and others net negative. And the risk we face is that the ones that ought to end up net negative will boast about their success in getting to net zero and stop at that point. And so it will find it incredibly difficult to get to net zero for the country as a whole, because we're doing it in a very inefficient way. A better way of doing it would be to price carbon. Not an easy thing to do, but we could try to go down that route more. That would be a new source of revenue for governments, which they're desperately short of. And that would provide incentives for everyone to limit their emissions, but allow for the fact that some activities and some industries are bound to create more emissions than others. And we're not doing it in that sensible way. Instead, we seem to have a moral crusade in which everyone is supposed to get to net zero. And that is the least efficient way of achieving a national target of net zero.
Isn't it a reality too that in truth, what we're doing in the West in many cases is simply shifting? The accounting systems seem all wrong. If you're really worried about it, you ought to be looking at what individuals are actually producing, regardless of where whatever it is that their consumers produced. So you've got the problem of leakage. We're exporting industries.
No, absolutely. So if you were to have a carbon tax, you need to have
global.
It's either global or it's got to have some adjustment for imports and exports. Because you're right. I mean, it's the same debate came up with pollution, decades ago, where people said, well, it's actually more efficient to export pollution to countries that can cope with it better. But for climate change, it's not a question, if you simply export the activities that generate emissions to other countries, you're doing nothing to reduce total emissions. So, but the trouble is that, all these conferences, the words COP29, that says all you need to know about it. 29 of these have taken place. What has happened to climate change? Some progress, but nowhere near enough. And simply having conferences where people make great speeches and grandiose promises but don't deliver is valueless.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And it does seem to me we ought to keep in mind that whether we like it or not, the consumption of all fossil fuels rose strongly last year and is reaching record levels again this year. That's the reality of it globally. But again, this comes back to, it seems to me, to the question of integrity. The reality is that all of the processes that we are engaged in the West at the moment will mean lower living standards for people in the West. It will also mean more geopolitical transfer of power, if you like, away from us.
Yes.
But the Australian people are not being told that. I think they might sense it. I doubt that the British people are being told that, or the Europeans, although in many ways a lot of people in Europe are in rebellion, aren't they? They're saying enough. And it's breaking out as what's called populism, but maybe it's not so much populism as a rejection of policies where there's not the integrity to say, we actually expect you to lower your living standards because we can't live as well as we have in the past.
The common thread to recent political events is a rejection of incumbent governments. And I don't think it makes sense to think of it in terms of left versus right. It's actually a rejection of those people who were in power. And unless we change much of this, then the next lot will be rejected in due course and trust will be damaged further. So what there isn't, I think, is a sort of realistic setting out of the challenges, priorities and realistic timetables. So in the case of the UK, enormous focus on sort of green sources of energy. And that is something which can't happen overnight. The big challenge will be building and investing in the links to the national grid so that you can link where the various wind turbines and solar panels are to the national grid. I worry that we will be doing great damage to our domestic environment by building a lot of onshore wind turbines and solar panel farms everywhere. There's no need to do all that. We need to be more thoughtful about how we go about it all. And in the meantime, just recognize explicitly that fossil fuels will be playing a major role. And in the case of the UK, we've done very little to build storage of liquefied natural gas, which would be a very sensible thing to do, because there are clearly moments when green sources of energy don't operate, the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. What's the backup? A lot of hand-waving about nuclear power. We haven't actually, we've spent vast amounts of money building a very small number of nuclear power stations. The existing ones are coming to the end of their life. The new ones, partly French and Chinese models, that doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of defense. Technology may come to our rescue, but you need to wait, take advantage of it when it does. Small modular reactors. But we still have no solution to the problem of disposing of nuclear waste. In the meanwhile, natural gas is a very sensible thing for us to use. And yet, when it comes to a political debate, it becomes almost religious in its intensity. Green is good, everything else is bad, rather than a sensible balancing of a transition from one to the other. And, one starts to despair when you hear some of the comments and the rhetoric, as well as the protesters, who somehow feel that any activity in Britain that's linked to fossil fuels or oil, even if it's a company that has some small dealing with a company that produces fossil fuels, if they contribute money to a literary festival, the festival has to be cancelled. Yeah. This is sort of madness, yeah. and it is genuine madness, and it will damage us unnecessarily. You can deal with climate change in an efficient and effective and sensible way, but not in a way that is sort of self-harming, which is what we're tending to do.
Couldn't agree more. A couple of lasts, if I may, but very importantly, the question of China and trade. You'd have to say, as we look at it now, there's quite a chance that Trump will be the next president of the United States, and he's talking about massive new tariffs, effectively, particularly aimed at China, but not only at China. He's talking about a 10% tariff on all imported goods into America.
Yeah.
This is extraordinary stuff, but it does raise the question of wise policy in relation to China. Europe now is worried about them dumping their overproduction induced problem with electric cars, for example.
Right.
Much of what we've taken for granted over the last 50 years, rising prosperity, lifting people out of poverty in the third world, it's been done by the opening up of trade, frankly, policed by the Americans. They're not so sure they want that role anymore. It's also been done with available and affordable energy and with scientific research, all of which seem to be less and less popular today. Any thoughts on how we might try and argue the case for sensible trade policy, including geopolitically? We do need to stop the Chinese from behaving against their stated commitment to free trade. They're plainly not engaging in it.
Well, this is clearly very difficult, and in some ways, I think Trump himself missed an opportunity by not convening a sort of small G4 meeting with Europe, US, UK, China, to talk about the fact that there's no point harming ourselves collectively by doing things which individually we feel we have to do if other people carry on as they are. And I think that still is an effort worth making. China needs to switch away from manufactured exports and boost domestic consumption. They need that, I think, in order to rebalance their own economy and to ensure that the population feels they're benefiting from the rapid growth of the Chinese economy. If all you're doing is producing more and more exports, or more and more building highways and buildings that go nowhere, you're not benefiting the standard of living of the Chinese people. So they do have an interest in rebalancing their economy, and we have an interest in no longer running such large trade deficits. Clearly, much of the damage has already been done. I think that what economists and others overlooked was the fact that although potentially trade can make everyone better off, that doesn't guarantee that it will make everyone better off. And we saw, particularly in the United States, communities which had been based on a particular industry just lose out. Those firms all close down. The community is disrupted. People are supposed to migrate to somewhere else. The speed of change in their manufacturing decline was very rapid.
Yes.
And in a sense, they were experiencing what we went through in the early 70s, early 80s, and again, to some extent, the early 90s. But we had the advantage that people lived closer together, so they didn't have to move, and you didn't see whole communities being abandoned. But it goes back to what I said earlier on, that people, as they grow up, they have aspirations, they have hopes. They may feel they would like to follow their parents into the same kind of jobs, in the same firms, to live in the same community, to be able to buy a house there. Much of that has been totally disrupted. And that's led to disillusionment, not least because they could look around at their own societies and see people who were highly educated, doing very well out of the globalization. And they thought, this is not fair. I'm paying the price for these people becoming better off. And that's not how you create any sense of political harmony. So we have a very strong incentive to deal with this. Simply imposing tariffs and trying to banish trade is not a sensible answer, because in the end that will hurt one's own domestic population. But finding a way through it does require, I think, re-establishing some networks at the geopolitical level that will recognize the problems that we all have and deal with it. So, if China realized that, they would face a much more hostile environment in the West unless they rebalance their economy, then if they were to do that, we would find it much less likely that we'd be running large trade deficits, which would lead to the further decline in manufacturers and other industries. There ought to be a pathway here in which everyone can be better off. But to find it will require extraordinary political leadership. I don't think I'd rule out the Chinese being open to that. The problems, it's not straightforward. I think the previous Chinese regime, it would have been possible to have dealt with it. Now it's much harder. And, you just can see straight away that they've put on the table as part of any bargain what's going to happen to Taiwan.
An interesting China observer, a very thoughtful man, said to me the other day that if we could get this terribly wrong. He said, for a start, in relation to Taiwan, if you want to limit Chinese aggression, don't think you'll do it by pointing to your military might, because the president's done such a good job of creating an environment where nobody would be brave enough to say China couldn't prevail.
Indeed.
But he went on to say, I asked him about tariffs against China. He said the worst thing you could do is increase them a little bit here and a little bit there and piecemeal, because the Chinese will adapt their economy to it. It would be better. He said the one message they'd understand, I suppose I just put this down as an observation more than anything else, was that if the world were that leadership issue again, the rest of the world were combined together to effectively saying, we want to trade with you and we will trade with you, but be aware that if you launch any military adventurism, we will combine together to stop trade with you. And that would be one language the Chinese would understand, because whilst it would hurt our GDPs in most countries that export to China and import from them, the cumulative effect on China would be much more powerful. It was an interesting observation.
No, and there's a lot of truth in that. And it would be sensible to try and put together that coalition before any action that the Chinese might take on Taiwan rather than afterwards. Because
Yes.
once they've taken it, then actually you can try to impose sanctions, but you start immediately to see that there are leakages to sanctions. The incentives are to stop the sanctions from working properly. The big incentive you want to influence is what China will do vis-a-vis Taiwan, knowing that what the consequences would be. So there's a lot of sense in that. Now, I'm not well equipped to judge how committed the Chinese are to dealing with Taiwan at some point, because 2049 will come round, and if they haven't got Taiwan back, there could be a great sense of disillusionment, certainly with the current regime, and it may fall to future Chinese leaders to explain to their population why it doesn't make sense to put so much emphasis on getting Taiwan back. They can find a way of, one country, two systems approach again. They've destroyed that in Hong Kong, obviously, but maybe going down that road again and maintaining trading relationships with the rest of the world is a better choice for them than trying to overcome a long period of economic sanctions following what might well be a successful invasion of Taiwan. But what do they gain from that? Enormously. So, I mean, these are the issues that need to be debated and discussed. And it will require the sort of leadership that we saw, I think, towards the end of the Second World War. But it will be an awfully pessimistic conclusion to draw that the only time you can get leadership of that caliber is when you're facing a really critical wartime experience or some other very damaging peacetime experience like another pandemic.
Thank you so much for your time. I have one final one I'd just be interested in your views on. On the surface of it doesn't sound such a big one, and yet I suspect perhaps it is. In the midst of all of the calls for the digitalisation of our economy, some people are talking about us becoming cashless. As a former central banker, do you have any thoughts on whether it would be wise to do away with cash?
I think it would be pointless to sort of end cash completely. The use of cash has clearly declined in many aspects of our daily lives. So I'm very struck that in London now, every taxi driver will accept a payment by a credit card and you just tap it on it, make the payment. That's been a transformation. That happens in many aspects, most shops and so on. But I can't see any merit in simply banning the use of cash. Most central banks say we will supply cash on demand. If there's a demand for it, we'll meet it. And let people decide how much they want to use. That is the right thing to do. I think the issue that people have got terribly excited about are sort of combination of cryptocurrencies and central bank digital currencies. Now, cryptocurrencies, I think, are really the same as going down to your local betting shop and betting on horses. There's no point preventing people from doing it, but they should accept the consequences, which is if they lose the bet, their money's gone, and yet shouldn't expect to be compensated by the rest of us. And if people want to bet on various cryptocurrencies, well, okay, but they can't, in my view, replace any existing currency that's worth the name of it, because they're highly volatile. The prices go up and down like a yo-yo. Well, you don't want the value of the Australian currency, the pound sterling, the euro, the dollar to go up and down like a yo-yo, because the other side of that coin is that the price level is going up and down of goods and services all the time. So it can never do that, in my view. It's a speculative investment, like a bet. And none of us really have any idea what ultimately they'll turn out to what value they'll have. The only value they have is the value you can get from finding the next person to sell it to. And we know what happens in that kind of market. Sometimes it will just crash. So I don't think the cryptocurrencies will have a major role. They're a sort of maybe a fascinating sideline for people who want to bet. Central bank digital currencies, equally, I think, do not have much of a role in most advanced economies because, we have a competitive commercial banking system that offers the benefits of competition, new services, cheaper services, and it's digital. I mean, all my banking transactions I make through my computer. I don't need a central bank digital currency to do that. And it's not even a new currency, because if we were to do it in Britain, it would still be in sterling. So for households, I don't think there's any particular value in it whatsoever. And there are some real dangers, because if you had a central bank digital currency and people started to speculate there might be a financial crisis, maybe some of our big private banks are at risk here, their deposits would flow immediately into the central bank digital currency, unless the central bank said, oh, you can't hold more than a certain amount with us, in which case, what's the point? And for a wholesale, for institutions, by banks, for example, we already have a central bank digital currency. It came about through quantitative easing, that when central banks print money, they give checks to the people who sold their bonds, government bonds, to the central bank, and they deposit that check drawn on the central bank into their bank account, and the commercial banks take it back to the central bank and add it to their reserves with the central bank. So reserves with the central bank, held by financial institutions, play the role of a central bank digital currency, all of which adds up to the conclusion that the committee of the House of Lords, in which I sat, the Economic Affairs Committee, which wrote a report on central bank digital currencies, and our title of the report was A Solution in Search of a Problem. I can't see a problem that we have enough problems to worry about in the West today. We don't need to worry about central bank digital currencies. We do need to worry about all the things that we've been discussing.
You've been very generous with your time. Thanks so much for crystallising the essence of so many of those problems, suggesting ways forward. I think we'd both agree on one thing. Let's hope it acts as a spur for tomorrow's heroes. We need some heroes.
We do. Sadly, they're likely to be younger than you and I, John.
Well, we're about encouraging them.
We are.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.